What if Excitebike was on a snowboard? That's essentially the question I continue to ask myself as I work on my latest Pico 8 project, which is still untitled. When last I checked in with you about this project, I talked about parallax scrolling and level parsers, and if either of those topics interests you, I would encourage you to watch that video. I will link to it on the screen somewhere and also in the description. This time, I want to talk about a simple, some might argue, rather obvious change that I made to the mechanics, immediately making the game feel way more interesting. So a quick introduction to the game, or a refresher if you've been here before. The way this game works is you're a snowboarder, you hit a ramp, the ramp launches you into the air, and when you land, you can land on one of 3 different potential angles on the ground. If you align your board to the ground correctly, then all is well. If you don't, you'll lose a little bit of speed, and since this is a racing game, ideally we want to keep our speed as high as possible, so the player is thus incentivized to land the jumps correctly. Now in the last episode, I had demonstrated that I added a little speed boost if you land properly too. So my intention there was obviously to enforce that board angle mechanic, to make it more worth doing, right? You get to go even faster if you land it correctly. But as I sort of sat down and fiddled with this and played through it for the 17,000th time, this brief 15-second blurb, it all felt a little bit too thin to me, especially in contrast to other titles that inspired me, like Excitebike and Slalom and stuff like that. A lot of this, one might argue, is probably due to the fact that there was only one little level that we're looking at right now, and that level only lasts about 10 to 15 seconds. That's probably part of the problem. But I actually suspected that wasn't all of it. I suspected it was more about the player not having enough to think about and not having enough to do as they played. So the only thing the player has to do as they progress through the level is just adjust the board angle, which is done with left and right. It's strictly reaction based. And, action games, and specifically what you might call arcade games, often have like a strong reactive element, so I think that's fine. But what are we missing? If the mechanic part feels good, what can we add to make it feel, a little bit meatier? Well, there's no choice here. The player's not making any decisions. There's no strategizing, right? So the interaction with the game is pretty shallow. It's because it's strictly mechanical. So how do we make this very thin interaction fatter? How do we make it feel more gamey? So like we were saying, when you go over a ramp and you hit the ground correctly, you get a boost of speed, and that fires automatically. So to me, the easiest way to add some aspect of choice was to allow the player to control when the boost fires. Rather than getting that boost automatically, you're given a small bank of up to 3 boosts. This reminds me a lot of the original F-Zero on the SNES. Even though I didn't plan on referencing that game directly, that's kind of where my brain went. Anyway, if you land successfully, you get 1 chunk of boost juice, and you can use those chunks whenever you want. But why is this different than just having it fire automatically? If we're thinking of the boost as a sort of resource, like a currency, each level is going to have a fixed amount of that resource, of that currency, and that's going to be determined by the number of ramps in the level. So for each ramp, you could potentially get a single nugget of juice. But whether we spend that currency automatically, or we allow the player to decide when they're going to pull it out of their boosty bank to spend it, the quantity of the currency doesn't change. So intuition might tell us that if the count of boosts in a level is the same, whether or not the player controls when they fire shouldn't have any impact on the outcome of a play session, right? Well, let's challenge that idea with some numbers. So I've drawn the same sort of fictitious course 3 times here. So we're going to do 3 different examples, 3 different sets of numbers. Buckle up. So in this fictitious course, it's 30 meters long in total. The first 10 meters, which we'll call the blue segment, is the straightaway and then a ramp. So the 10 meters includes the ramp. The second segment is the green segment. Again, it's a straightaway and a ramp. Diagrams are not to scale. I know that doesn't look the same. It's not the same. I'm in paint, for God's sakes. And finally, the third segment, it's just the orange segment, and it's just a straightaway. There's no ramp, right? So in total, 10, 10, 10, that's 30 meters. So for our first exercise, let's say we're spending the currency automatically. The player's average velocity for this first blue segment is going to be 1 meter per second. And for this exercise, we'll completely forget about air resistance or friction or any of that stuff, just constant velocity, right? So anyway, blue segment, they're going to go 1 meter a second, and that should take them about 10 seconds to cover then. Not about, it should take them exactly 10 seconds. Let's say they do a perfect job here and they land that first jump, and automatically they get a boost. So for the second 10 meters, our green segment, they'll be going 2 meters per second, which means they'll cover the green segment in only 5 seconds. Okay, finally, this player is really good. They're going to land the second jump perfectly too. They'll stay boosting, and again, they'll cover the orange segment, the final segment, in only 5 seconds because they'll be going 2 meters a second. So in total, 10, 5, 5, they do this whole thing in 20 seconds. Now what happens if the player screws up a landing, right? What happens to the velocity? Well, let's say for the first blue segment, everything is the same as our first example, right? So they're going to go 1 meter a second, it's going to take them 10 seconds. And let's say they're going to land the second jump, and we're still using the automatic boost, right? So they're going to boost as soon as they hit the ground. That means they'll get the increased velocity, and they'll cover the green segment in 5 seconds once again. So far, nothing has changed. Now, disaster. Let's say on the second ramp, they don't stick the landing. They're going to pay a velocity penalty, and they'll only go 0.5 meter per second. And let's say this velocity penalty, it's temporary, right? It only lasts 10 seconds. That's like super long, but let's just say, to make the math nice, it'll last 10 seconds. And in that 10 seconds, they'll be able to travel the first 5 meters here. So halfway home. Now their velocity goes back up to 1 meter a second, and they're able to finish at that velocity. And since there's 5 meters at 1 meter per second, it'll take them 5 seconds. Okay, so what's our total? 10, 5, 10, 5. That's 30 seconds. Okay, but that makes sense, right? Because they screwed up the jump, so it should be slower. Let's make it interesting. What if we let the player decide when they do that boost? So remember in this last example, they hit the ground perfectly after the first jump. We automatically use the boost, and then they screwed up the second jump. What happens if we change the rules? We let the player decide. We're going to do the second scenario again, but with the optional boost, with the player control boost. So again, no change for the first part. 10 meters, 10 seconds, because they're going 1 meter a second. And let's say they land the first jump, like they always do. They're so good at that first one. And the player has a choice. So let's say this player doesn't use the boost. So for the green segment, they're not boosting. They're still going to go 1 meter a second. And that'll take them 10 seconds to clear the second segment. Okay, but wait, this is worse, right? Because in our first two examples, they did blue and green segments in 15 seconds. This time they're up to 20 seconds because they didn't use the boost. What's going on? This is worse. Okay, wait, this is going to get interesting now. So let's say on the second jump, again, they screwed this up. They don't land the jump. They pay the velocity penalty. They're going to go down to 0.5 meter a second. But because this player is good at this game, and they recognize that if they boost, they could bring their velocity back up to 2 meters a second, they do that. And again, to make the math easy, let's say it takes them 2 seconds to realize that they can do this. So they're good, but they're a little slow on the draw. 2 seconds is an eternity. So they're paying the velocity penalty for 2 seconds, which means they've able to travel only 1 meter, about that far, not to scale. And then the boost kicks in, right about here, right? They've still got 9 meters to go, or 1 meter here. There we go, 9 meters left. And they're gonna be traveling at 2 meters a second. And 2 meters a second to travel 9 meters, well, that's gonna take you 4.5 seconds. I know, I checked. And they finished the course. Now, what was our total time this time? We've got 10 seconds, 10 seconds, 2 seconds, and 4.5 seconds. I bet that's 26.5 seconds. This means that in total, even though they screwed up the second jump, just like before, they were able to recover with the boost and finish in 26.5 seconds rather than 30 seconds. So what we've done here, by giving the player a bit of choice, is we've increased the number of possible outcomes. If they screw up a landing, they can use the boost to recover. Or if they want a boost to get over a particularly tricky jump, they can do that too, right? So if we think of the boosts like a currency, some sort of resource, even though the amount of currency in this course remains the same, right? There's only 2 possible boosts you can get. And in the second and third examples, the player only got 1 of those. So even though that's all the same, we increase the number of potential outcomes by letting the player decide when they're going to spend their money, their speed money. So now we know that giving the player something to decide, something to think about, can potentially give them actually more control over the outcome of their play. But why introduce a 3-boost cap? Why not make it unlimited? If anything, the cap feels like it's a limitation because the player's mechanical success now may or may not result in another negative boost. Because if they've already got 3, even if they land the jump, they can't get any more. Isn't this a constraint? Yes, it totally is. And I think that's the point. See, every time the player is approaching a ramp, now they're thinking about how they're going to land the jump, and also whether or not they need to burn a boost beforehand. And if they're going to do that, does the additional speed change their landing angle because they're going to travel farther? And if it's worth it to stay under that boost cap at the risk of making the jump more difficult. And yeah, it just spirals out of control. It automatically introduces all these new complications. To summarize, at the top of the video, the only control that the player had over the outcome of the game was, can they tap left or right with the correct timing? And based on that, they would win or lose. So we made 2 changes. The player controls when the boost fires, and they can only carry 3 boosts at a time. And those changes led to all the extra decisions that I outlined a second ago. Again, I think those particular changes were pretty obvious ones to make, and they definitely come from obvious sources, as I pointed out. But what was less obvious, to me anyway, was exactly why this made things feel more gamey. So I hope I've been able to explain what my thinking was. My sense is that when the player only has a single mechanical way to control the outcome of a play session, that just doesn't feel like much. It doesn't feel very gamey. But, if you add some extra decisions and that increases the number of possible outcomes, you get a little gaminess. I don't know, I'm still sort of figuring all this out, but I hope you found it helpful, or maybe you just like numbers and that was the fun part for you. In any case, I appreciate you. Thank you for your time and attention. I have been Eric. This has been Radical Slice.